All right, so I want to kind of go through what's the difference between intertextuality and adaptation. And we're going to get to fan fiction, right? But I think it's really important to kind of distinguish when something is using just a intertextual element and when there's an extended engagement with an intertextual element, right? And that's what I gave you in Hutchin, right? So, we can say that a fan fiction is still a continued intertextual engagement with the text, but it is saying something new or giving a new plot or inserting a new character, right? Where there is a lot of works that could be considered adaptations, but they're not because they're just utilizing intertextual elements. And I thought that this example between Hamilton and Macbeth might help you to think about this. Okay, so again, to give you some examples of intertextual elements, it's when, you reuse one single image to think about another text, right? Like the clueless suit, to interject that into another text, or to have the Hannibal face mask, or the Nirvana album cover, right? You just use a single image to evoke something. Now that Family Guy Star Wars, right, that's a whole episode. That's not quite an intertextual element. If, it shows up in the background of something, sure. But that is an extended engagement, so that's a little different. That's more of an adaptation. But like the single image is really what we're talking about with intertextuality. Okay, and also a lot of you have thought about adaptation as book to movies, and the kind of remediation of the text into a different form is important. And what I think it's really important to do is to think about what is gained and lost between, right? I think I brought up, we'll talk about it later, but the Watchmen movie is almost like a shot-by-shot remake of the source text, and that's not quite an adaptation. That's almost just a remediation. So, it's easy just to say, oh, book to movie is an adaptation. But what I want you to start to realize is what changes. Like, what about bringing it into a movie gives it a different affordance than it does in a book? Or what's lost, right? If there's internal monologue in a book, how does a movie do that, right? It could be really lazy and just do a voiceover, or it could do something else that's interesting, right? It could do it in the shots. So, in a fast and loose way to kind of think about the difference between intertextuality and adaptation is referencing the original, where adaptation is a recreation, right? Of inserting a zombie into the text, and giving everything else to be Pride and Prejudice is an adaptation, right? So again, this is where you can see, so intertextuality is different. Adaptation and fan fiction are very similar to one another. But what I want you to think about is adaptation is usually this legitimizing word, right? Like a movie to book is we often consider to be an adaptation, but is it saying something new, right? Okay, so I want to give you an example of like using intertextuality and when that's not quite adaptation. Okay, so in Hamilton, the song Take a Break, he says, they think me Macbeth, ambition is my folly, right? So he is signaling that, hey, my story is very similar to Macbeth, right? And he doesn't go to pains to make the story similar, but he is referencing it, right? And then he also says ambition. So if you look at Macbeth, Act 1, Scene 7, you see ambition. And so, but it's used in a little different way than what Hamilton used it as. But they're definitely borrowing terms, right? He's borrowing language. Folly. Now, this is in the same verse, and this is a Lady Macduff talking. So, there is a borrowing, but there's also a remix where it's hinting at the text, but it's not trying to recreate it. So that it's so remixed makes it an adaptation, right? And I think, the fact that fan fiction does not remix the text enough makes it fan fiction. Okay? The problem is we've used adaptation as a blanket term, and that is not what it should be, right? Think about Hutchin. It needs to have some bite. It needs to have some commentary. So what's interesting about Hamilton is it's combining different characters, right? It's combining different things to create something new, right? And Birnam Wood is Congress on its way to Dunscain, right? And then another line from Macbeth. So there's all, and this is the apparition. So there's all these voices that are getting combined to one, right? And that's remixing and remaking. Now, I'm not saying that Hamilton is a remake of Macbeth in any way. But, it begs the question, is this adaptation or intertextuality? When you have this much engagement with a text, right? But it's so different and it remixes it enough, it is, it's almost an adaptation, okay? And so what I want you to think about is levels of abstraction, right? So if you abstract a text, right? Macbeth is, a story about ambition gone too far, right? So if you abstract that enough, you're like, well, all stories about ambition being a folly are Macbeth stories, right? So this is important to think about levels of abstraction, right? And where audience and publics recognize that, right? You don't want to do something where you abstract it enough and people don't realize that you're really talking about, Macbeth, right? And so this is what gets into Aristotle, right? So you're thinking about tragedy as this really abstract process. And so, you can look at most stories as being tragic, and that's not what we do, right? There are small differences. So what I want you to be careful of when you're defining terms is how far you're abstracting from the concepts of the source text. This is where in English studies, we always try and tell you, give me an example. Give me a quote from the text, right? That brings us back down and that gives us specifics. Okay, and what I want to also kind of throw in, and we'll go over this later, is because I'm a digital humanist, I'm going to show you some ways of abstracting text and realizing that they're really not the same. Okay, so I took the script of Hamilton and I looked at the most frequent words, right? So, it shouldn't shock you that Hamilton, Washington, Burr, Company, Eliza, No are all the most common words in Hamilton. Okay, and this isn't going to tell you much, but you could see that green, Burr. It's really interesting that Burr comes in really hard at the end. But again, you can look at the term Hamilton and you can kind of look at that graph and go back to the Aristotle and be like, the way that Hamilton's used is very similar to that graph. Is it a tragic story or not? Right? So this is where you get, like, if you're really abstract out of the text, you can kind of say anything about it. And here we go with Macbeth. King, lord, good, enter, right? King, good, lord, man. Right? It's not as specific as Hamilton, right? Hamilton is very specific to that person, where there's these concepts of king and lord, right? And again, you can look at graphs and think about, like, oh, is this a tragic structure because of the way that king is used throughout the text or not, right? So I hope that clears up some things about adaptation, intertextuality, and fan fiction, okay? So fan fiction doesn't change enough. It doesn't remix enough, right? Now, if you abstract it enough from the source text, it looks very similar to the source text, right? Where you abstract something like I showed you with Hamilton, and there's no way that it's a Macbeth adaptation, but it uses Macbeth in a really interesting way, in an intertextual way that says something about both Macbeth and Hamilton, okay?